Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the SB Technical Subcommittee meeting. Today, our special guest is Michael Liebert. He's the Global Client Director at All4. He is a directing consultant located in St. Louis, Missouri, and he's been working in the environmental compliance industry for over 25 years and specializes in environmental regulatory applicability analysis, environmental compliance for manufacturing industries, preparation of emission inventories, environmental auditing, Title V operating permit applications, new source review air permit applications, MACT compliance, and the list goes on. I won't read the whole thing. You all have a copy of the agenda. But we're very happy to have Michael. I know he attended our conference in Tennessee this year. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to meet him in person. But today he's going to be speaking on the new PM 2.5 National Ambient Air Quality Standard. And Michael, you've got the floor, and then we'll have some time for questions afterwards.
All right. Well, thank you, Leanne. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. Yes, I had a great time in Chattanooga back in March, I think it was. I appreciate the invite to come down to that. So that was a great time. So yeah, I'll be talking today about PM 2.5 NAAQS. As many of you probably know that we have a new NAAQS as of March of this year. So with that, I will get into my agenda. I'm going to start off talking about the timeline for the PM 2.5 annual NAAQS. Then we'll review current and potential PM 2.5 non-attainment areas and the process and timing that goes along with that new non-attainment designation process. After that, we'll get into some of the air quality modeling that will be required for some of the projects that involve PM 2.5 and how those affect some of the areas that may or may not be non-attainment now with the new standard. Get into measurement issues, state implementation, and some of the flexibility that they are afforded with the new standards, and then just finish up with some conclusions and recommendations. So, and feel free to stop me as we go through this if you have questions. I'll try to answer them. All right, so let's talk about the timeline. This year, on March 6th, the US EPA finalized the 9 microgram per cubic meter standard for PM 2.5 annual NAAQS. So that was a very low standard compared to what it was before. It went from 12 down to 9. And so everyone was very kind of surprised that they went with 9. That was the lower of what they were looking to do. So there will definitely be some repercussions across the nation on the number of non-attainment areas based on this new standard. We'll get into that. April 30th of this year, EPA released a guidance document called the Effective Permitting Tools for PM 2.5, and the link to that is right there in the slides, and I can send these slides out to everyone too, if Leanne, if you want me to do that at the end. But this guidance just kind of takes all of a lot of PSD sort of language and guidance and puts it into one place and talks about PM 2.5 as well. Also on April 30th, the SIL, the annual SIL significant impact limit was lowered from 0.2 micrograms per meters cubed to 0.13 micrograms per meters cubed. And this was part of the guidance. And this is very important for projects that will need to do air dispersion modeling because we'll get into the implications in more detail in future slides. But lowering that SIL was a big deal, and I'll explain why later. May 6th of this year, the effective date came into play. That was 60 days after the March 6th finalization of the standard. So May 6th was the effective date. This was when the official PM 2.5 NAAQS was set at 9, down from 12. May 16th of 2024, this year, the Federal Register put out a notice, and this was important because it talked about the federal equivalent method monitors. These are monitors which monitor PM2.5, and specifically the Teledyne T640 monitors were now showing a bias when compared to the federal reference method monitors. And what that means is that these monitors for some reason had a 20% high bias showing. And so the EPA acknowledged that. And again, I will get into what they did about that later on in the slides, but that's the timeline of what's happened recently. Let's talk about timeline for what's to come. So there's a 2-year clock now. So by March 6, 2025, the states and the US EPA have to approve the designations. And so that would make it by March 6, 2026, we will have all of the new PM2.5, or most of them, annual attainment designations. So your area will know whether it's in attainment or in non-attainment by 2 years from now, roughly March 6th. There are some caveats to that, and I can explain that. There's some outlier counties that may have more time to make the designation if they apply for that year-long extension. So what happens then? At that point, the states then have 18 months to develop, and US EPA has to also approve their non-attainment, what we call SIPs, and SIPs are state implementation plans. And basically what that is the states have to come up with a plan to get all the non-attainment areas back into attainment. And this is by December of 2027. And what they typically put in those state implementation plans are what's called reasonably available control technology, or RACT, or more severe air quality modeling requirements. So there's a number of levers to pull to try to get your area back into attainment. March 6, 2032, which is a ways off, is the target attainment date. So that is what the EPA has said that they want these non-attainment areas to get back into attainment by. If for whatever reason the area is not able to achieve attainment by that date, then the classification will change from a moderate non-attainment area to a serious non-attainment area. And then that gets into more permitting and more levers to pull to try to get even more scrutiny on the emitters in that area to have more, we'll call them permitting roadblocks put in place. All right, so let's talk a bit about what is the implications of your area being designated as non-attainment in March 2026. What happens then? Well, if your area is non-attainment, then states then have 18 months to develop their state implementation plans to get the area back into non-attainment. And as I said before, the RACT can be involved with that. And what that is that's the lowest emission limitation that particular sources are capable of beating by the application of control technology that is reasonably available considering technical and economic feasibility. So it's also kind of like backed, but you're able to look at control technology and makes a potential permittee put on control technology to control the PM2.5 to a level that would hopefully get you back into attainment by that 2032 date. Also, permitting new sources and modifications becomes more stringent, and I'll explain how that works on the next slide. All right, so in non-attainment areas, there's for large permitting projects, there's more scrutiny put on these projects, and some of the things that they make you do in a non-attainment new source review permit includes emission reduction credits. So in other words, if you are having a number of PM2.5 tons of emissions in your project, then they may have you look at trying to find reductions in the area of that project to offset the PM2.5 tons that are being increased as part of your project. Lowest achievable emissions rate. It's kind of like BACT, but if you're familiar with BACT, best available control technology is what we use for PSD projects. This is similar to BACT analysis, but one thing is that you do not get to use any sort of economic study. There is no, no matter how much the control technology costs, you would have to implement that control technology if you want to do your project in a non-attainment area. And another thing they look at is there an alternative site that might be available to do this project on? You'd have to do a study to show like why you couldn't do this site in an attainment area versus putting this PM2.5 project on in this non-attainment area. And the bottom of this just shows kind of the major source thresholds for non-attainment areas. So it's 100 if you're in a moderate non-attainment area, and it's 70 if you're in a serious non-attainment area. None of the non-attainment areas 2 years from now will be serious non-attainment until they prove that they can't get into attainment with the moderate level racked and thresholds or levers to pull for trying to get yourself back into attainment. I'll stop. I'll pause for a little bit. Is there any questions on what I've covered so far by anyone? Okay. All right. So what happens if your area is designated as attainment in March 2026? That would mean that your area is showing that your readings are coming out less than 9 micrograms per meters cubed, but you're not out of the water. There are some implications still with this new NAAQS that you should be aware of. So any new major news source review projects would have to go through PSD, which includes air quality modeling demonstrations. And as many of you are probably aware, air quality modeling can get very complicated and very hard to pass. And I'll explain why it's going to be even harder to pass now with the lowered NAAQS. But modeling in particular could be something that grinds your big capital project to a halt because the levels of background, and I'll explain what background is in a minute, but there's background that you have to kind of factor into your modeling, and the background levels are so high now that there's not a lot of headroom between what the background shows and what the new NAAQS level is. Step one of a PSD modeling demonstration is to just model your project's emissions and compare the results to the significant impact levels. So that SIL recently changed from the level that it was at to an even more lower level. And what I'm telling my clients is that, with a large PSD project, you want to try to get your project emissions under that SIL, because if you are not under the significant impact levels, then you have to go to another whole modeling of not only your project, but all the surrounding areas, which include the backgrounds, which we'll get into. All right, I know this is a somewhat busy slide, but bear with me here. I think it's pretty important. And if you follow the blue line here, that kind of shows the PM2.5 levels, and the red lines kind of show where the NAAQS have been. If you go over to the right side in the middle there, you see that the 2012 annual PM2.5 NAAQS was at 12. And you can see the delta between that red line and the blue line through the middle of the screen. We call that headroom. And that means that's the delta between where current PM2.5 average levels are and where the NAAQS standard is. So if you look over to the far right where you see that dotted line, you've got the revised PM2.5 NAAQS now at 9. And you see the levels there. If you look to the bottom, it's 2021 and 2022 are the most recent years we put on there. That delta between the dotted line and the blue line is getting smaller. And what that means is that for average projects, there's insufficient headroom for modeling purpose for a typical project. So in other words, if your project emissions alone when modeled can't be under that first level threshold, the sill, then you have to bring in all of the surrounding area background, and that's what that 8.55 is. And that means you have to fit your project into that tiny little delta between the 8.55 and the 9, which in most cases is nearly impossible. So that would be a major roadblock for many projects that would require modeling. This slide just kind of shows you where the contributions for PM2.5 come from. And as you can see here on the bottom and the right side, you know, the majority of PM2.5 emissions are coming from fires and dust in agriculture. I mean, those are three categories that can't really be regulated. So the regulated portions are there on the top left, and that's the mobile sources, the industrial processes, and the stationary fuel combustion. So it's very interesting that the majority of PM2.5 emissions are not able to be regulated. All right, so this slide shows that with the new PM2.5 NAAQS at 9, so before with 12, I think there was like 25 counties that are in non-attainment. With you know, looking at design values from 2021 to 2023, we're looking at an increase of, gosh, up to 136 counties. So from like 25-ish to 136, quite the jump of number of non-attainment areas across the nation. Now, this map was based on 2021 to 2023 design values. Those include the monitor adjustments, but not removal of exceptional events. When we'll talk more about what that means here in a second. But these attainment determinations, however, for the final standard will be based on 2022 to 2024 design values. So this map shows from 2021 to 2023. Obviously, we're not done with 2024 yet, so it might be slightly different once we get the 2024 values. I just wanted to make sure that everyone was aware that this is not final. All right, so I talked earlier about these teledyne monitors that had this bias that was discovered. So let's talk about that for a second. It's called the Federal Equivalent Method, FEM. Has shown bias when compared to the Federal Reference Method, FRM. So these are just different methods for monitoring PM2.5. And so these teledyne monitors, which you see in blue over on the right-hand side of your screen all over the map, these monitors were shown to have higher readings than the actual data from the other monitors was showing. This was a bias that was discovered of 20% for 24-hour concentrations when compared with the FRM monitors. So obviously that's a huge ordeal. It looks like we're getting, you know, faulty high numbers on all these blue monitors. So EPA had to take a look at that, and they have adjusted the data based on this 20% bias. Now, they didn't bring every reading down by 20%. There was a lot of evaluation that goes into each reading, and that has to do with like ambient temperature near the monitor and humidity and all kinds of variables that go into that. So you didn't get a full-on 20% reduction in all those readings. It varied from 5% up to maybe just under 20, but most of them were below 10%. So yeah, again, EPA looked at that, they adjusted the data, and the adjusted data was made available for the states to put into their evaluation. And again, the readings for 2024 are obviously not done. We're still waiting on the certification of the 2023 data. All right, so exceptional events. These are things that are sometimes factored into the readings that we're getting off monitors. And these would include fireworks displays. So if you have a fireworks display near a monitor, you're obviously going to get a higher reading of PM2.5. Prescribed fires. So these are fires that are intentionally set for agriculture or other purposes. Wildfires, you know, back in summer of 2023, there was a number of Canadian wildfires that came down and had a big presence across a lot of the Midwest and eastern portion of the United States. So just to go through what a wildfire is, any fire started by an unplanned ignition caused by lightning, volcanoes, or other acts of nature. So those wildfires are being considered for the 2023 data. So that might factor into, the PM2.5 monitoring data for 2023 being lowered at some point, but we'll have to wait and see. Other exceptional events are high wind, dust events, or stratospheric intrusions. Just a little bit more about exceptional events. The schedule is applicable to air agencies that intend to submit exceptional event demonstrations. So yeah, I might want to point out that it's up to the state agencies to submit these requests for exceptional events to be factored into the monitor data. And so the schedule is applicable to air agencies that intend to submit exceptional events demonstrations for events that have regulatory significance for the 2024 revised primary annual PM2.5 NAAQS initial area designations. The schedule is based on a 2-year initial area designation schedule. And if the administrator has insufficient information to make initial decisions in the 2-year timeframe, EPA may take up to 1 additional year to make initial area designation decisions. So, for instance, in Pennsylvania, the PADEP has requested that they get an additional year to analyze their data, and so that is where the administrator has the ability to delay this non-attainment designation by another year. All right, so let's talk about modeling a little bit. Unless anyone has questions, I can pause for a minute.
Oh, took me a minute to find the mute. This is Jennifer from Wisconsin, and just when you had those counties up,
Yeah.
I was noticing counties in northern Wisconsin, which usually have not been problematic, right? And it made me wonder, we don't know probably definitively, but I'm guessing fires are what's driving that question mark. That could be.
That definitely could be. See that little yellow area
Right
in
in
the
the middle?
middle of northern Wisconsin? Yeah, that's one that's going to change to non-attainment if we're using the 2021 to 2023 design values that are posted on the EPA website. That's what this map was based off of. So the wildfires that came down in the summer of 2023 absolutely may have an effect on that, and we'll have to wait and see whether the EPA is allowing that to be sort of lowered because of the effect of the wildfires. So good point, Jennifer.
Thank you.
All right, let me get back to where I was. Yes, so we were talking about modeling now. So obviously lowering can you guys see the Teams message that popped up? I'm sorry about that. So the lowered annual PM2.5 NAAQS modeling permitting requirements immediately upon finalization of a new standard. So anytime you have modeling demonstrations now, as I mentioned, you're going to need to model for PM2.5. And also if there's what we call precursor pollutants, which are NOx and SO2. So those pollutants actually cause what's called secondary PM2.5 emissions. So there's modeling required for not only PM2.5, but also secondary PM2.5, where NOx and SO2 are precursors. Minor NSR modeling requirements vary at the state level. So any state may have different requirements for what we call state level or minor permit applications. So you want to make sure that you check with your local state agency on what they're requiring for certain PM2.5 modeling going forward for state level permits. It'll be interesting to see. The the EPA has given the states a lot of flexibility with how they want to implement modeling for state level permits and also the timeline for when they want to implement it. There's a lot of leeway given there. So I talked about headroom before. So the biggest impact with this new NAAQS will be the reduced headroom. And again, headroom is sort of the delta between where the monitor data is showing background and where the NAAQS standard is. And the delta is very small in many of the areas now. So there'd be a lot of projects that if you require advanced modeling that has to have background in it, it's likely that you're not going to be able to meet the NAAQS with your modeling. So keep that in mind. I think that's one of the most important points that's come out of this lowered NAAQS 9 micrograms per meters cubed standard is the headroom has reduced very, very drastically. And so a lot of projects will not be able to go through if they require modeling. Let's see, US EPA's current modeling guidance requires addition of design concentration to peak annual modeled concentration. One thing that's also a concern is most states do not have complete PM2.5 inventories out there for modeling purposes. So that could be a big factor if you're trying to get your project through in a certain area that doesn't have a complete inventory to use for background. You know, that could be a roadblock. All right. So I talked in the beginning of this presentation, we talked about the SIL, the significant impact levels. So the class 2 SIL, so this is class 1 and class 2 areas. There's mostly class 2 areas. There's a minimal amount of class 1 areas around the country, but so mostly your projects will likely fall into a class 2 area. The SIL got revised from 0.2 micrograms per meters cubed down to 0.13. So the SIL was based on same statistical analysis performed in 2018 with updated data. There's some flaws to it, but it is what it is. This is what the EPA's guidance is saying. Now, remember, it is just guidance. Important note at the bottom there is that the significant impact levels used for modeling of projects are recommended by EPA. They are not mandatory. So the agencies have the discretion to use, you know, they could go all the way up to 0.3 micrograms per meters cubed. And there's some examples of different states like North Carolina, Iowa, Nebraska, going against the EPA guidance and allowing a higher significant impact level to be modeled for a project. All right, so this just kind of shows where the headroom is across the nation with the 2021 to 2023 data. If you look at the brown areas, those are areas that have zero headroom, which means like if you don't pass the SIL, then your project's not going through. So that's a concern, obviously, for industry in those areas. If they have a project where they want to, you know, get the project going when they have a significant amount of PM2.5 emissions, it may not be able to go through. So if you want to talk more about that, I can follow up with, you know, some one-on-one advice for folks that have clients in those areas. Yeah, there's things we can look at, but it's gonna be tricky. Just some conclusions and recommendations on modeling. So based on the new NAAQS, you've got major and minor new source review applications will immediately have to model against the lowered NAAQS. So there's no 2-year wait on that. This is immediate that you'll have to meet the 9 micrograms per meters cubed standard with current modeling. We talked about precursors. Those are not only PM2.5, but also SO2 and NOx are precursor pollutants that may trigger you to have to model PM2.5 as well. We lowered the SIL, talked about that. Exceptional event analysis. So as someone mentioned before, the wildfires that came down in the summer of 2023, We're still waiting on whether those are going to be factored into the PM2.5 monitoring data for that summer. Hopefully that'll help alleviate some of the higher readings that the monitors got because of that, what we'll call an exceptional event, which it absolutely was. Let's see, working with states to determine offsite inventories and representative ambient monitors becomes more important. So reaching out to your state agencies, making sure that if there are clients in the areas that want to do projects in the future, make sure that you know what kind of offsite or offsets are available, and also whether the state is applying for any of the exceptional event analysis to come off of the monitor readings. It's good to know that stuff. And then also, since there's not a lot of PM 2.5 data out there, consider collecting site-specific background PM 2.5. You can always monitor or direct your clients to monitor at their site just to show that they can then get data on their own site. And that's helpful. If it's good data, it's helpful to show where the backgrounds are. All right. So measuring, not as much PM 2.5 emissions data as other pollutants. Yeah, so that's another reason why monitoring on specific sites is a good idea. If they feel like they have good data they want to prove that, put the monitor out there. It's always good to be proactive about that. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot, as I pointed out in that one pie chart, there's just a lot of fugitive sources out there. And how are we able to accurately estimate emissions from all of the sort of non-measurable fugitive sources out there? That's a tricky thing. Might have to do stack testing. Stack testing is another option to sort of make sure that you're getting accurate PM 2.5 emission inventories. Yeah, no EPA approved method currently to measure PM 2.5 from wet stacks, so that's a concern. And we talked about the bias in some of the monitors. There's also bias in the data when you're measuring PM 2.5, and there's also ammonia or SO2 present. So just another challenge there with the measurement of PM 2.5. Let me pause there. Are there any questions on anything? Okay, I'll keep going. I mentioned before, states do have leeway in certain aspects of implementing, how they're going to go about permitting with the new NAAQS. And that is, so one is an implementation date. So with the new NAAQS is in effect for PSD projects, states can kind of have some flexibility with when to incorporate the NAAQS into their state programs. An example of this would be Iowa, Wisconsin, and South Carolina. We've seen those states talking about timelines and flexibility on when they're going to implement their state level stuff and based on the new NAAQS. The significant impact level, again, it's a recommendation only. This is just guidance, as was the previous SIL. If you have a state where they allow you to go higher than the guidance, those would be North Carolina, Iowa, Nebraska, for example. You are able to go up to 0.3, so that new standard is not, set in stone. So one thing would be to maybe talk to your state about potentially going higher if they're not meeting the new SIL, because there is discretion there. And then also atypical event handling. So there's flexibility on the state level of, when you can modify background concentrations based on those events that I talked about before. Atypical is a little bit different than exceptional event guidance. It's more like localized things like fireworks, for instance, and more, fireworks is the exceptional event. There's other more localized events that actually have the atypical event definition that you can negotiate with your state on whether that can factor in to be able to bring your background levels down. So just some stuff on that. I know I'm running long on time here, so I think we'll skip the atypical So if offsets are really important. One of the things you want to talk with your state about is does the state have a banking program for offsets? And again, offsets are if you're trying to do a project in a non-attainment area and you are increasing the PM 2.5 in that area that's in non-attainment, you're going to have to get offsets. And those are basically buying credits from reductions of PM 2.5 from other sites. So check with your local state agency on whether offsets are available. What nearby sources are available for offsets. Sometimes you got to get creative. You can talk to other facilities about whether they want to, put their offsets on the market. How large will the non-attainment area be? So this is a question. How far from the source can we go for offsets? So there's, no hard and fast rules about where offsets can be acquired from. So could talk to your state about, whether they would allow offsets from, let's say, 50 miles away or 100 miles away. Also, is it easier to do your own emissions reductions projects and not trigger review? So you could potentially put in controls or, eliminate some of the emission sources at your site is definitely an option. So these are just some things to think about. Okay, final slide here, just conclusions and recommendations based on this new standard. NSR applications, so NSR is new source review. These are major projects, PSD, will immediately need to model against the lowered PM 2.5 NAAQS. So I just want to reiterate that there's no 2-year wait on that. That's immediate, that the 9 micrograms per meters cubed standard is in play now. Modeling below the PM 2.5 significant impact level, which again was revised to 0.13 from 0.2. To avoid the NAAQS modeling, the reason you want to avoid the NAAQS modeling again is because NAAQS modeling will have the background of the area put into it, and that headroom delta between where your background is and where the 9 micrograms per meters cubed standard is very, very small in most areas. So it's essential that you're able to get below the sill for your project, so you don't have to bring in all those surrounding area background and facilities. So yeah, if you're located in an area that has a potential to become a PM 2.5 non-attainment area, you do still have 2 years to obtain a permit before the non-attainment new source review permits requirements kick in. So again, that would be the layer, which is something that you would have to look at all the control devices that you're going to put in, and there's no economic evaluation that goes into that. You have to put in the most expensive control device that has been proven to knock down PM 2.5 emissions. And so there's other things like offsets and alternative site evaluations that have to be considered, but you have 2 years before your area goes into non-attainment and those requirements kick in. Finally, make sure that this is something that you guys would tell your clients, make sure to let your capital projects team know that this could be a project deal breaker in some of these areas. So do your due diligence about your area and the readings on the monitors before planning the project, because this is going to be a factor and could be a roadblock. So I think getting out in front of it and making sure that you're informed on what your area is with regard to the new standard is very important. And with that, I will kick it back to Leanne and answer any comments or questions that you have for me.
Thanks, Michael. Appreciate all the information. And yes, if you could send me a copy of those slides, I will make sure to pass them on to the applicable people. So yeah, let's open it up for questions.
Hey, Michael, nice presentation. Thank you. I was curious, and I'm a novice at best as far as air permitting. I did hear used to be that within a facility or maybe other facilities where you are shutting down an emissions unit, that you could take advantage of a credit within a 2-year time frame. And so I don't know, with all the brouhaha about trying to eliminate combustion, thus eliminating or reducing CO2, Do you see shutdowns as a potential source of emission offsets?
Yes, actually, the rules on that changed a few years back for PSD permitting applications. It's very complicated. Anyone who's done PSD permitting knows that there's a lot of complexity in it. But essentially, the rule changed about 4 or 5 years ago that for a project that you could now look at negative emissions, or i.e. like shutting down other PM2.5 sources or putting control devices on sources, and take credit for those reductions in your accounting, project emissions accounting for the project. And so the short answer to your question, Mark, is that yes, for PSD applications, you can factor in negative emissions for either eliminating PM2.5 sources or controlling them to a greater degree.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, seeing none or hearing none. Michael again.
Excuse me.
Oh,
Yes, sorry, this is Lena.
no, go ahead.
Kansas. Sorry, thank you for the excellent presentation. I have a question, like, does the state receive funds to do this work? Like, I'm sure, like, they will have to look at the peak values and eliminate all those, the wildfire days and exceptional, those kind of days. So it's a lot of work involved. Do they get extra fund for this?
I'm not aware of any extra funding that's available for this. I think this is kind of baked into the budget of the states. At least, I mean, honestly, I'm not really in tune with the budgets of state agencies, but my guess is that there is no funding for the extra evaluation. But I certainly could be wrong, and I'm sure that there's other folks on the call that might know the answer better than I.
Okay. And also, I have another question. Like, so in your opinion, like, it will be in a non-attainment area, it will be difficult for a small business to get a permit?
Well, that really depends on the situation. Small businesses getting a permit, it really depends on the level of PM2.5 emissions that are part of that particular project. Typically, smaller businesses wouldn't have, a great
Yeah.
increase in PM2.5, and so modeling might not come into play. In fact,
Yeah,
probably
exactly.
won't come into play. And so I would say for the majority of smaller projects, they'd be able to go through to a certain degree, but it really depends on the scope and size of the particular project.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Michael, there was a question in the chat. What is a PM 2.5 inventory for a state?
What is a PM 2.5 inventory? So all of the states for all pollutants have an inventory that they're required to compile, and that helps with knowing what level of offsets are available and for all kinds of other analysis that they're required to do. PM 2.5, you didn't even have to model for PM 2.5 back 10 years ago or more. So the inventories are sort of behind for the pollutant of PM 2.5, whereas there's more advanced inventories for other pollutants. But essentially each state keeps an inventory as best they can of where the pollutants are and what the levels are.
So Michael, might a state assume that PM10 is equivalent to 2.5, even though PM 2.5 would really be a subset of PM10?
Well, PM 2.5 is part of PM10, but PM 2.5 is obviously also its own entity based on the particle size. I'm not sure I fully understand your question, Mark.
Without having better data, I've seen, at least as far as potential emission calculations, no bother with trying to calculate, PM 2.5. They'll have, in fact, actually PM 10 is a bit of a challenge. But they'll assume that PM 10 and PM 2.5 are going to be equivalent, knowing that the PM 2.5 would be a conservative value if it's equated with PM 10.
Yeah, that's correct. So with any lack of ability to quantify PM 2.5, sometimes it is assumed that PM 10 is PM 2.5. Yeah, that's right.
So, Michael, are there industry sectors or types of operations, other than, say, like power plants, where you're expecting the lion's share of the PM 2.5 emissions?
It really goes across the board. I mean, we see so many diverse industries that have PM 2.5 in their projects. So I can't really say that there's, cement plants and, refineries and all kinds of different like big emitters have PM 2.5. So it's hard to pinpoint down. It cuts a wide swath of different industries, Mark.
Yeah, plus, as you had said, Michael, one of the biggest contributors are mobile sources, which aren't even regulated. So that
Yeah,
makes it that much more difficult.
Yeah, at least they're factoring in the wildfires from 2023. It's good to see that those exceptional events are being analyzed and hopefully discounted to a certain degree by the EPA.
Right, for sure. There's another question in the chat. Could coal mining near a source be an atypical event?
No, coal mining is not an atypical event. That is something that is, doesn't fit one of the 5 categories. It's an industry that is ongoing and unfortunately would not fit that definition, in my opinion.
And that doesn't matter whether it's underground or strip mining then.
Well, no, it doesn't matter in the question of whether it would be an exceptional event. But it would matter just on how much of the background is affected by the certain PM 2.5 that's emitted from each of those separate, I guess, industries. But yeah, no, it's very prescriptive on what can be considered an exceptional event, and I think they're listed in the slides. So anything that doesn't meet those would not be considered an exceptional event.
So Michael, going on, what are some, I guess, typical air pollution control devices that one might employ to reduce PM 2.5? I can think of electrostatic precipitators, but I'm assuming there are probably some other types of control devices as well.
Well, the biggest one is your baghouse. That's the typical control device for a PM. You get the baghouse, electrostatic, some scrubbers. So those are the big ones.
Okay. Last call for questions. All right. Thanks again, Michael. Our next meeting is November 19th. That's going to be